The disclosures for guests on this podcast can be found in the show notes.
Hello and welcome to JCO at ASCO 2026, our series where we cover some of the top JCO papers published simultaneously with their abstract presentation at this year's meeting in Chicago. I am Dr. Davide Soldato, host of the Journal of Clinical Oncology podcast, and I'm joined by Dr. Eileen O'Reilly, JCO Associate Editor. Today, we will discuss the Journal of Clinical Oncology article and ASCO annual meeting abstract presentation, Pemigatinib for unresectable or metastatic cholangiocarcinoma with fibroblast growth factor receptor 2 rearrangement, results from the phase 3 FIGHT-302 trial by Dr. Bekaisab and colleagues. Welcome, Dr. O'Reilly, and thanks for speaking with us.
Great. Thanks so much. Nice to see you. Nice to be here today.
So I just wanted to start a little bit with the relevance of this article. Can you explain to us why this was selected as an abstract for presentation at the JCO annual meeting, and also why we decided for a simultaneous presentation?
These are great questions to ask. This is an important study. It's one of the first comparing a FGFR inhibitor compared to chemotherapy in frontline untreated metastatic cholangiocarcinoma. And maybe just to set the scene, for cholangiocarcinoma, our typical treatments are chemoimmunotherapy based on the TOPAZ-1 and based on the Keynote 966 trial. So we know that FGFR fusions rearrangements occur, depending on what data set you look at, somewhere between 10, 12%, but maybe it's actually a little bit less. And I think that's one of the learning points from this study. But this is a head-to-head comparison. If you do actually have an FGFR2 fusion rearrangement, how does that rank compared to chemotherapy? And there have been a number of efforts, and one has previously been reported, closed early. This also closed early, and it was comparing Pemigatinib, taken daily, orally, continuously, compared to cisplatin and gemcitabine. So this was before TOPAZ-1, Keynote 966 data emerged, and that was one of the issues in terms of the study. The study closed early, but the bottom line and the key point to understand is that the progression-free survival, which was the primary endpoint for the 83 patients who were randomized to Pemigatinib compared to cisplatin and gemcitabine, was superior. It was 8.3 versus 6.8 months with a hazard ratio of 0.58 and a p-value that was notable as 0.0078. And that was supported by duration of response, the overall response rate, median overall survival was similar. There were a percentage of patients on the chemotherapy arm who at the time of progression crossed over. That was about 80%. And for those who crossed over, their survival was similar to those who received Pemigatinib up front, but it was different to those who didn't receive Pemigatinib.
You mentioned a little bit that there were some limitations, and especially the fact that the trial unfortunately did close early, and also the fact that the standard of care in first line has changed since then. So with this concept in mind, do you think that there is still something that we need to answer in the space of the first line therapy for patients diagnosed with this malignancy, especially considering that, as you were mentioning, these are really rare molecular alterations. More than 4,000 patients need to be screened worldwide to arrive to the 150 patients, more or less, that were included in the study. So just two different takes. One, are there still some questions to be answered in the first-line space? And considering that cholangiocarcinoma carries a lot of this rare mutation, should we change a little bit the way we conduct studies in this particular disease and based on these molecular alterations?
Thank you for bringing up the limitations. It is a key one that the study did not complete enrollment, and primarily because of the changing landscape, but also recruitment was challenging. And we saw that in the PROOF study, similar style, and we saw another FGFR inhibitor, Fibroblast, compared to chemotherapy in the front line being terminated because of poor recruitment. That is a notable point. I do think there is a role for targeted therapy in the front line. I don't think asking this question again is going to be a productive exercise, but conceptually, right? A target, a therapeutic, and a match is a good thing. And I would say the totality of the data support that. And does this give us an option to consider that approach in the front line? I think it does. But like for every patient that we treat, we're always weighing up what are the pros, what are the cons, what are the individual characteristics of the tumor, what are the patient preferences, committing to an oral targeted medication, which has some side effects, versus chemotherapy. And there's no black and white on this. I think we find the data from the study consistent with what we know in the second line space and leaving an option in the front line. But I don't think it's a slam dunk in the front line either.
Absolutely. And as you were mentioning, what I think that this study also adds is the possibility to reinforce the data that we had previously in the second line space, because it's true that we already had data with this molecule in particular, but it was really from a phase 2 study. So we already had some data, but I really think that the possibility of crossing over to Pemigatinib for those patients who've received standard line chemotherapy in the context of this trial really also adds to the information that we had. And in terms of safety, actually, it was very comparable. And I don't know if you want to give us a little bit of what is your impression in terms of clinical practice, because this really looks like a very tolerable treatment for patients.
Yeah, so this class of drugs in general are fairly tolerable. They're given orally. This particular one is given on a continuous dosing schedule from this study at 13.5 milligrams daily. There are class effects, and they depend on the mechanism of action of the drug. So this particular drug is a second generation inhibitor. It does have the classic effects of hyperphosphatemia, and that can be an issue in practice. And we do see that for a good percentage of patients. Not everybody by any means needs treatment. And we often live with the phosphorus running a little bit higher, sometimes guide some dietary adjustments. Cutaneous toxicities can be an issue. And these are discomforts that we have to manage for people. And, it is not uncommon that we do need to interrupt dosing for some and some dose adjustment. But the safety profile, I think, again, was very consistent across the spectrum. It does bring some of the newer generation inhibitors, which may have potential advantages. And I say potential because we have to prove this yet in terms of blockade of resistance mechanisms to this second generation class of inhibitors, and maybe the isoform selective inhibitors that cut out some of the phosphorus binding issues that we see in the kidney for this class of drugs. So that's to some degree where the field is going. In cholangiocarcinoma, we have the luxury of two drugs with Pemigatinib and Fibroblast being available, with Infigratinib based on a similar study actually being removed a number of years ago in the US. So it's always good to have choices. But I think both remain options here. And I do think that as we get more sophisticated in terms of understanding resistance and addressing resistance, that's going to impact on our choice of therapy in the clinic.
And I also think that this is something that the study needs to be commended for, because actually there is also some translational data and some data on the mechanism of resistance when patients were progressing to the line of treatment that they were receiving, and particularly with Pemigatinib, both in the first and second line setting. So I really think that this also tells us a little bit that even if a study is not definitive in terms of answers, as this one was, because of the problems that we mentioned before, so the enrollment and the change in the standard clinical practice, there is still a lot of merit also when we use these trials to provide new insight. So you were mentioning a little bit before about irreversible and targeting resistant mechanism. Just a brief point on this to know what's your opinion.
Thank you. And I agree with everything you said. It is very important to see these data, right? They have implications for practice. They inform how we think about choices in the clinic, and it reinforces the current approach of primarily using these drugs in a second line setting, but it does give the option in the first line. And we see on target resistance, right, where we see it in the kinase domain of these drugs, and theoretically using a different drug which blocks that can be potentially valuable. A second mechanism of resistance that we see, that we learn from circulating ctDNA, and where available, tumor-based analysis is off-target mechanisms. So other alterations, for example, in the same pathway, in the MAP kinase pathway, in the mTOR and the PI3 kinase pathway, and theoretically they're using combinations that block some of those could have value. Another question that comes up, and this is, as we think about combining a targeted agent with chemotherapy, we have some precedent for this with the breakwater data, with the osimertinib data in lung cancer. Might there be a value, right, of combining this particular targeted agent with chemotherapy, just the non-specific effects of chemotherapy? Maybe that's going to block some of the resistance mechanisms as well. And there's some small data sets speaking to that, but I do wonder whether that's a worthwhile strategy and the combinability of these two approaches in this disease for future direction.
Dr. O'Reilly, I really want to thank you again for speaking with us about the JCO article, Pemigatinib for Unresectable or Metastatic Cholangiocarcinoma with Fibroblast Growth Factor Receptor 2 Rearrangement, results from the Phase 3 FIGHT-302 trial. Join us again for the latest JCO simultaneous publications presented at ASCO Annual Meeting 2026. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to all ASCO podcast shows at asco.org/podcast.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.